The pause stretched between us like a held breath, 5 seconds, maybe 6, and in that pause, I watched Thomas Caldwell's face do something complicated and multi-layered that I had no framework for interpreting yet because I had known this man for less than an hour and had no catalog of his expressions to reference, no history of his tells, no understanding of which particular arrangement of his features meant what. But I was my mother's daughter in at least one way. I could read a room. I could read a face, and what I read in Thomas Caldwell's face during those 6 seconds of silence was not the careful blankness of a man constructing a lie, or the rehearsed composure of a man delivering a prepared answer. It was the naked, undefended expression of a man who had been asked the question he had most dreaded and most needed to be asked, simultaneously, for 30 decades. "Yes," he said finally, "and no." I waited. He unclasped his hands from behind his back. I hadn't even registered that he had moved them there, that unconscious, formal posture of a man standing at something like attention, and he reached into the interior breast pocket of his navy jacket with the careful, deliberate movement of someone retrieving something fragile and irreplaceable. What he produced was an envelope. Not a new envelope, not something crisp and recently prepared. This was an envelope that had been handled. The edges were soft with age, the white of it yellowed to the particular cream of something that had spent years in proximity to human warmth, in a drawer, in a box, in a jacket pocket that had apparently been its home for long enough to reshape the paper to the slight curve of the chest beneath it. He held it out to me. I didn't take it immediately. I looked at it. I looked at him. I looked at my own name written on the front of it, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Rachel, just that. No last name, no address, just my first name in blue ink in a hand that was careful and deliberate and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who didn't write by hand often, but had taken particular care with this. "I wrote it when you were 3 years old," he said. "I had found out through someone who knew your mother that you existed, that you were healthy, that you were living in Ohio." He kept his hand extended, the envelope steady in his grip, his eyes on my face. "I drove to your neighborhood. I parked on your street. I sat in my car for 4 hours. I took the envelope. It was lighter than I expected. Everything that has enormous weight in the emotional sense is always physically lighter than you expect. I have noticed this about life. The things that carry the most gravity weigh almost nothing in your hands. "You sat on my street," I repeated. "He watched you play in the front yard," he said. You had this red plastic tricycle. You were wearing a yellow raincoat, even though it wasn't raining. You kept riding the tricycle in a circle in the driveway, and every time you completed the circle, you'd throw your arms up like you'd won something." My throat closed completely. I knew that tricycle. I knew that yellow raincoat. I had a photograph, one of maybe a dozen photographs I possessed from early childhood, because my mother was not a woman who documented sentiment, of myself at approximately 3 years old, in a yellow raincoat, on a red tricycle, squinting into the sun with a profound sense of self-satisfaction. I had looked at that photograph 100 times. He had seen the real version of it. "Richard came outside," Thomas continued, and his voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it steady was visible in the set of his jaw. "He came out to the yard, and he picked you up off that tricycle, and he swung you up onto his shoulders, and you screamed with the most delighted laugh I have ever heard in my life." He paused. "And you were so happy. You were so completely, purely happy with him. And he looked at you like you were the most important thing in his world, like there was nothing else." I pressed my lips hard together. "I drove away," he said simply. "I told myself it was for you. I told myself you had a father, a real one, a present one, a man who had chosen you when he didn't have to, and showing up would only damage something that was working. I told myself that enough times that I almost believed it." He looked down briefly, then back up at me. "The truth is, I was also afraid of your mother, of the disruption, of not knowing how to be what you needed. I was 29 years old, and I was a coward, and I have paid for that cowardice every day since. I looked down at the envelope. "Why didn't you mail it?" he said. Because a letter felt like an excuse. It felt like the easy version of something that deserved to be hard. I always told myself I would deliver it in person when the time was right, when I was brave enough. A long pause. 30 years is a long time to work up to brave enough. I turned the envelope over in my hands. The seal had never been broken. It was still intact, still closed. 31 years of undelivered words preserved inside it like something in amber. I looked up at Thomas Caldwell, this 61-year-old stranger with my eyes and my jaw and my shoulders, and I asked the question that had been building in me since the moment he said my name in that reception hall. "Do you have any idea what it did to me?" I said quietly. Growing up feeling like I didn't belong, feeling like my own mother couldn't fully love me, and not understanding why, spending 31 years thinking there was something fundamentally wrong with me. His face fractured, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of someone performing grief. It fractured the way old wood fractures, quietly, along the grain, in a way that reveals how long the pressure has been building. "I think about it every day," he said. I looked at the envelope. I slid my finger under the seal. The seal gave way with a soft, papery whisper that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of that parking lot, and I registered peripherally that Vanessa had moved closer. Not intrusively, not crowding the moment, but close enough that I could feel her presence at my left shoulder like a warm current of air, and I was grateful for it in a way I didn't have the words for yet. I unfolded the letter. 2 pages. Both sides of each page covered in that same careful, deliberate handwriting that had spelled my name on the envelope. Blue ink, slightly faded with the passage of 30 years, but entirely legible. Every word preserved with a clarity that felt almost aggressive, given how thoroughly everything else about the situation had been buried and obscured and kept from me. I read the first line silently. Then I looked up at Thomas. Then I looked back down at the page, and I started reading it out loud. I don't know exactly why I made that choice to read it aloud rather than privately, there in the parking lot under the amber lights with my sister at my shoulder and the man who wrote it standing 3 feet in front of me. Maybe it was because I had spent the entire evening saying true things publicly in a room full of witnesses, and something in me had decided that private truth was how we got into this mess in the first place. Maybe it was because I needed to hear the words in my own voice to make them real. Maybe it was simply because I was 31 years old and I had just found out my entire origin story was a carefully maintained fiction, and my capacity for making rational decisions had been temporarily suspended. Whatever the reason, I read it out loud. "Dear Rachel," I began, and my voice was steady in the way that voices sometimes go steady when emotions exceed a certain threshold, and the body simply decides that falling apart is not an available option right now. "Dear Rachel, you don't know me. You may never know me. I have made choices that make it very possible that you will live your entire life without ever hearing my name, and I have to find a way to make peace with that, even though I'm not sure I ever fully will." I paused. Vanessa made a soft sound beside me. I kept reading. "I am writing this letter because I need there to be a record somewhere, even if it lives in a drawer for the rest of time, even if no one ever reads it, of the fact that I knew you existed, and I thought about you, and the weight of your existence in this world has been something I have carried in my chest every single morning since the day I found out you were real." The amber light was very steady overhead. The crickets were still going in the hedges. Somewhere across the parking lot, a door opened and closed, and the distant sound of the wedding reception drifted out briefly. Music, voices.
before being swallowed again by the night. I turned to the second page. I watched you today. I know that sounds strange. I promise it comes from love and not from anything frightening. I sat in my car on your street, and I watched you ride your tricycle in your yellow raincoat, and I watched your father, your real father, the man who chose you, the man who is more your father than I will ever be, swing you up onto his shoulders. And you laughed. Rachel, the way you laughed, like the whole world was designed specifically for your joy, and you knew it and you claimed it completely. My voice broke on that last sentence. Just slightly, just once. I pressed on. I want you to know that the laugh I heard today is the sound I will use for the rest of my life when I need to remember that purely good things exist in this world. You are 3 years old, and you have already given me something irreplaceable without knowing it, and without owing it to me. And that is the most honest summary of who I am in relation to you. Someone who has received something enormous from you while giving you absolutely nothing in return. I stopped reading. I stood in that parking lot and I pressed the letter against my chest with both hands, and I looked up at the amber-lit Ohio sky and breathed through the wave that was moving through me, not fighting it, not redirecting it, just letting it move through my body the way grief needs to move when you finally stop blocking its path. Vanessa's hand found my back. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand between my shoulder blades and kept it there, warm and steady. "There's more," Thomas said quietly. "I know," I said. "Give me a second." I gave myself a second. Then I looked back down at the page. "I don't know what kind of life you'll have. I hope it is enormous. I hope it is full of people who see you clearly and love what they see. I hope you inherit your mother's elegance, and whatever stubborn, inconvenient honesty lives in me that I have never been able to fully suppress, even when it would have been considerably easier to do so." I laughed at that, a small, surprised, genuine laugh, because I had spent 31 years being told directly and indirectly that my stubborn honesty was a character flaw, that my inability to simply accept things quietly and move on was a problem to be managed, that my insistence on saying true things out loud was inappropriate and disruptive and selfish. And here was the man I came from, a man I had never met, this man who had sat on my street in his car for 4 hours 30 years ago and driven away, and carried his cowardice and his love in equal measure since then, describing that same quality in himself with something that sounded almost like affection. I read the final paragraph. "If you ever find this letter, if somehow, someday, the universe decides that you deserve more honesty than I was brave enough to give you in person, I want you to know one thing above everything else. You were not a mistake. You were not a consequence. You were not a complication. You were the best thing that came from the worst choices I ever made. And there is not a day that passes that I don't hope you are somewhere in this world throwing your arms up at the end of every circle you complete, still claiming your joy like it belongs to you." I folded the letter. I held it against my chest. And then I looked at Thomas Caldwell, my biological father, this stranger, this man who had sat on my street in his car for 4 hours 30 years ago and driven away and carried his cowardice and his love in equal measure since then, and I said the most complicated, most honest thing I could find. "This letter is beautiful, and I am so angry at you." "I know," he said, "and I don't know what to do with this tonight." "You don't have to do anything with it tonight. You don't have to do anything with it ever, if that's what you choose. I just needed you to have it." I nodded once. Then I heard the reception hall doors open again behind me, and the last person I expected to see walked into that parking lot.
I turned around slowly, the letter still pressed against my chest, Vanessa's hand still warm between my shoulder blades, Thomas Caldwell still standing 3 feet in front of me, and I watched my mother walk through those reception hall doors into the amber-lit parking lot like a woman walking to her own sentencing. She had fixed her hair. I noticed that first, the automatic, reflexive detail of it, because even in the middle of the most catastrophic night of her life, even with her mascara tracked down her cheeks and her champagne gown slightly rumpled, and her entire carefully constructed family narrative lying in pieces on a marble reception hall floor, Diane had paused somewhere between the door and here to smooth her chignon back into place. That single detail told me more about my mother than almost anything else could have. The instinct toward composed presentation running so deep it functioned even in crisis, even in collapse, even when everything else had failed. But her hands were not composed. They were clasped in front of her, tight and interlocked, the knuckles pale with the pressure she was applying, and they were trembling, slightly but unmistakably trembling, in the way that hands tremble when the body has been flooded with adrenaline and emotion for an extended period and has simply run out of the resources needed to maintain stillness. She stopped at the edge of the parking lot. She looked at Thomas first, a long, complicated look that contained 30 years of history I was not privy to and might never fully understand. And something passed between them in that glance that was not warmth and was not hatred, but existed in the complicated, exhausted territory beyond both. The look of two people who had done damage to each other and to someone else, and had lived with that damage for so long it had become simply part of the landscape of their lives. Then she looked at me. And my mother, Diane, composed and elegant and controlled Diane, the woman who had never once in my memory apologized for anything, because apologizing required an admission of error, and admissions of error required a vulnerability she had spent her entire life fortifying herself against. Opened her mouth, and what came out was not words at first. What came out was a sound. A single, raw, unguarded sound that I had never heard from her in 31 years, and that I recognized instantly as the thing she had been keeping locked below every cold look, and every calculated silence, and every moment of withheld warmth for as long as I had been alive. It was the sound of something breaking that had been under enormous pressure for an enormous amount of time, and it lasted only a second before she pressed her hand over her mouth and stopped it. But I heard it, and it undid something in me that I hadn't expected to be undone tonight. "Rachel," she said, her voice stripped of every layer of performance and control, reduced to something I barely recognized because I had never heard it before, just her voice, just her actual voice, without the architecture of Diane built around it. "I owe you more than an apology. I know that. I know there is no version of sorry that is large enough for what I have done." She stopped, steadied herself visibly. "But I am asking you, I am begging you to let me try to find the words anyway." The parking lot was very still. Vanessa had gone completely motionless beside me. Thomas had taken a quiet step backward, not retreating, just making space, understanding with an instinct I was grudgingly beginning to respect that this moment was between my mother and me and required his absence from the foreground. I looked at this woman who had carried me for 9 months and raised me for 31 years and kept a secret that rewrote my entire understanding of myself and struck me across the face in front of 200 people and had somehow, impossibly, also managed to be the primary architect of every strength I possessed, because that is the devastating complexity of difficult mothers, isn't it? The very hardness of them is sometimes what makes you hard enough to survive. "Talk," I said. She flinched at the flatness of it. "Good. I was 28 years old. Your father, Richard, and I were in a very dark place.
There were things happening in our marriage that I have never spoken about publicly, and I am not going to use them as excuses tonight, but I want you to understand that I was not in a good place when I met Thomas. She glanced briefly at Thomas, who received her glance with a stillness that confirmed he had heard this accounting before, or at least anticipated its shape. When I found out I was pregnant, Richard and I had just reconciled. He knew the timing was He knew there was a possibility that the baby wasn't his. We did a test. I paused on that. When the results confirmed what we suspected, Richard sat across from me at our kitchen table and he said, "She is ours. She is mine. We don't speak of this again." My throat tightened. Richard, my Richard, the man who had swung me onto his shoulders in the front yard while Thomas Caldwell watched from a parked car and drove away, the man who had called me my little firecracker and snuck me extra dessert, the man who had chosen me, actively, deliberately, unconditionally chosen me, and then died when I was 9 years old and left me alone in a house with a woman who had never quite been able to look at me without seeing the evidence of something she couldn't forgive herself for. "He was a better person than me," my mother said quietly. "In that moment and in every moment after it, he loved you without reservation, without condition, without the complicated feelings that I struggled with." She stopped. Her hands tightened against each other. "I tried, Rachel. I need you to know I tried. But every time I looked at you, I saw my own failure, my own shame, and instead of dealing with that shame myself, like an adult, like a mother, I let it bleed onto you. I let you carry the weight of something that was entirely, completely mine to carry." The amber lights hummed overhead. I realized my face was wet. I hadn't noticed myself starting to cry. It had simply happened, somewhere between Richard choosing me and my mother's voice stripped of its armor. The tears had arrived without announcement and were tracking quietly down my face in the dark. "You slapped me," I said. "I know. In front of everyone. I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I panicked. "You were saying true things, and I have spent 30 years running from true things, and when you stood there and said them all out loud in front of everyone I have ever known, something in me just—" She stopped. "There is no excuse. I am not offering one. I am telling you what happened inside me, and I am telling you it was wrong, and I am telling you that the look on your face when my hand—" Her voice broke completely on that, fractured right down the middle. "The look on your face is something I will see every day for the rest of my life." I stood in that parking lot under the amber lights of a June night in Ohio, 31 years old, holding a 30-year-old letter against my chest, my sister's hand on my back, my biological father a respectful distance behind me, and I looked at this woman who had carried me for 9 months and raised me for 31 years and kept a secret that rewrote my entire understanding of myself and struck me across the face in front of 200 people and had somehow, impossibly, also managed to be the primary architect of every strength I possessed. Because that is the devastating complexity of difficult mothers, isn't it? The very hardness of them is sometimes what makes you hard enough to survive. "Talk," I said. She flinched at the flatness of it. "Good. I was 28 years old. Your father, Richard, and I were in a very dark place. There were things happening in our marriage that I have never spoken about publicly, and I am not going to use them as excuses tonight, but I want you to understand that I was not in a good place when I met Thomas." She glanced briefly at Thomas, who received her glance with a stillness that confirmed he had heard this accounting before, or at least anticipated its shape. "When I found out I was pregnant, Richard and I had just reconciled. He knew the timing was— He knew there was a possibility that the baby wasn't his. We did a test. I paused on that. When the results confirmed what we suspected, Richard sat across from me at our kitchen table and he said, "She is ours. She is mine. We don't speak of this again." My throat tightened. Richard, my Richard, the man who had swung me onto his shoulders in the front yard while Thomas Caldwell watched from a parked car and drove away, the man who had called me my little firecracker and snuck me extra dessert, the man who had chosen me, actively, deliberately, unconditionally chosen me, and then died when I was 9 years old and left me alone in a house with a woman who had never quite been able to look at me without seeing the evidence of something she couldn't forgive herself for. "He was a better person than me," my mother said quietly. In that moment and in every moment after,
She crossed the distance between us in 5 steps, and she put her arms around me. Not a polite embrace, not the kind of stiff, obligatory hug that had been the entire physical vocabulary of our relationship for as long as I could remember, the kind where two bodies make brief, careful contact and then separate with mutual relief, like two people who have bumped into each other accidentally and are both being gracious about it. Not that. This was different. This was my mother wrapping both arms around me and pulling me against her with a fierceness that I felt in my sternum, that I felt in my spine, that I felt in every place in my body that had been waiting, without my conscious permission or awareness, for exactly this specific thing for 31 years. Her hand went to the back of my head the way you hold something you are terrified of dropping. Her other arm banded around my shoulders and held on with a grip that communicated something beyond words, something that words had apparently been insufficient to carry for 3 decades, and that her body was now attempting to transmit directly. I stood completely rigid inside that embrace for approximately 4 seconds. Every cell in my body that had been trained to expect coldness from this woman, to brace for the chill of her distance, to protect itself preemptively against the specific pain of reaching toward her and finding nothing reaching back, all of those cells were on high alert, sending frantic signals, warning me that this was new and new was dangerous, and that the safest thing to do was to hold myself apart from this, to not let it in, to protect the walls I had spent 31 years building. Because walls exist for a reason, and the reason was standing right here, holding me like she was trying to make up for 31 years of not holding me in a single continuous moment. But walls are exhausting. I had been holding mine up for so long, since I was 7 years old eating a birthday dinner in silence, since I was 16 and handed someone else's car keys, since I was 22 and moving to Chicago with 2 suitcases and a fierce, lonely pride that I had dressed up as independence, because independence was easier to wear than need. I had been holding those walls up for 31 years, and I was so tired. So I let them down. Not forever, not completely, not in the naive, undiscriminating way of someone who has learned nothing from 31 years of hard experience, but enough. Enough to let my arms come up and wrap around my mother's back. Enough to let my forehead drop to her shoulder. Enough to stop holding my breath and just breathe her in. The familiar smell of her, her particular perfume, something floral and expensive that she had worn my entire life, that I had smelled on her winter coats and her guest room pillows, and had always associated with the complicated ache of wanting something I couldn't quite reach. That smell, on her actual shoulder, with her actual arms around me, was almost more than I could process. I heard Vanessa make a sound behind me that was half sob, half exhale. I heard Thomas Caldwell say nothing at all, which was exactly right.
My mother was crying. I could feel it in the slight shaking of her shoulders, the way her breath came unevenly against my hair, the way her grip tightened and then tightened again, like she was afraid I might disappear if she eased the pressure even slightly. Diane was crying, in a parking lot in Ohio, in a champagne mother of the bride gown, holding her overlooked daughter, 31 years too late, and somehow also exactly on time. Because the truth about healing is that it doesn't have a schedule, and it doesn't care about your preferred timeline, and it arrives when it arrives, and the only choice you get to make is whether you open the door when it knocks. I opened the door. We stood like that for a long time, long enough for the crickets to continue their indifferent symphony in the hedges, long enough for a car to pull out of the far end of the parking lot and sweep us briefly with its headlights as it passed, long enough for the warmth of that June night to wrap around both of us like something intentional. When we finally separated, we didn't go far. My mother kept both hands on my shoulders, and I let her, and we stood in each other's arm's length and looked at each other with the kind of direct, unguarded honesty that had apparently required an entire evening of public catastrophe to make possible. Her face was a ruin. Mascara, tears, the flush of prolonged emotion, all of it had dismantled the careful presentation that was normally her first and most impenetrable defense. She looked older without it. She also looked more real than I had ever seen her, more human, more like someone I might be able to reach if we were both willing to do the very hard, very slow, very unglamorous work of actually trying. "I have loved you," she said, and her voice was rough with crying. "Not the way you deserved, not with the complications that were my fault and not yours, but I have loved you, Rachel. You are my daughter. You have always been my daughter, and I have always, underneath everything, underneath all of my failures and my fear and my shame, I have always loved you." I believed her. That surprised me. I had expected to feel skeptical, to hear those words and feel the reflexive distrust of someone who has been burned enough times to stop believing in fire's warmth. But standing in that parking lot with her hands on my shoulders and 31 years of history between us and a letter pressed against my chest from a man who had loved me from a distance in a completely different kind of failure, I believed her. Complicated love is still love. Imperfect love is still love. Love administered badly, love warped with shame and fear, and a young woman's inability to separate her feelings about her own choices from her feelings about the child those choices produced, all of that is still, underneath it all, love. It doesn't excuse the damage. It doesn't erase the birthdays or the graduations or the 1,000 small daily withdrawals of warmth that had shaped me into someone who needed to move to Chicago and build her own life because her original one hadn't felt safe enough to stay in. It doesn't excuse any of that, but it's still love. And I was 31 years old, and I was exhausted, and I had just had the most catastrophic and clarifying evening of my life, and I was not ready to throw away my mother along with everything else that had been overturned tonight. "I need time," I told her. "I know," she said. "I need a lot of time, and I need honesty from this point forward, complete honesty. No more comfortable silences, no more protected fictions, no more me being the last person in my own family to know the truth about my own life." "Yes," she said without hesitation, "whatever you need." I stepped back from her hands. I turned to look at Thomas Caldwell, who was standing at his respectful distance with his hands in his pockets and the patient stillness of a man who has learned to wait. "I'm not ready for you yet," I told him honestly. "I'm not saying never, I'm saying not tonight. Tonight is too much." He nodded once. "He'll be here," he said simply, "whenever, whatever that looks like." I looked at Vanessa, my sister, in her ruined wedding makeup and her silk dress and her bare feet on the Ohio pavement. "Go back to your husband," I told her. She laughed, a wet, wobbly, completely genuine laugh. Are you sure? I can stay out here. I can. Vanessa, I looked at her steadily. Go be with Derek. This is your wedding night. Go. She crossed the distance between us and hugged me hard and fast, her arms fierce and brief. Then she pulled back and looked at me with those guilty, loving, newly honest eyes. I'm going to spend a long time making this right. I know, I told her. So am I. She went back inside. My mother looked at me one more moment, opened her mouth, closed it, seemed to decide that she had said what needed saying tonight, and that anything additional would be surplus, and then she turned and followed Vanessa. Thomas Caldwell met my eyes across the parking lot. And then I turned away from all of them and walked to my rental car alone. I sat in the driver's seat in the dark for a long time before I started the engine. And then my phone buzzed.
The screen lit up the interior of that rental car with a cold blue glow, and I sat there in the driver's seat with the engine still off and the June night pressing quietly against the windows, and I looked at the notification without picking up the phone for a full 30 seconds. It was from a number I didn't recognize. No contact name, just 10 digits and a message preview that showed only the first line before cutting off. Enough to make my heart stop completely, not enough to tell me anything I actually needed to know. I picked up the phone with fingers that weren't entirely steady, and I opened the message and I read it. Rachel, my name is James Caldwell. Thomas is my father. I found out about you 4 months ago, and I have been trying to find the courage to reach out ever since. I know I was there. I was at the wedding. I sat in the back and I watched everything, and I want you to know that what you did up there with that microphone was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed in my life. I don't know what any of this means yet. I don't know what you want or need from any of us, but I have a brother named Patrick, and we both know you exist now, and we wanted you to know that we're here, whatever that means to you, whatever you want it to mean. No pressure, no timeline, just, hi, we're here. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, and I stared at the windshield, and I thought about a 7-year-old girl eating birthday dinner alone in a yellow kitchen while her mother sewed a costume for someone else's recital. I thought about a 9-year-old girl losing the one person in her house who had made her feel chosen. I thought about a 22-year-old woman loading 2 suitcases into a taxi in Ohio, jaw set, eyes dry, telling herself that leaving was strength and not also grief. I thought about all the versions of myself that had survived without a full family. And then I thought about a message from a half-brother named James, who had sat in the back of a wedding reception and watched me pick up a microphone and tell the truth, and called it the bravest thing he had ever seen. I picked the phone back up. I typed 2 letters. Hi. I hit send. Then I started the engine. And for the first time in 31 years, driving away from my mother's world didn't feel like exile. It felt like the beginning of something. 93 days after my sister's wedding, I sat across from Thomas Caldwell in a quiet coffee shop in Columbus, Ohio, and ordered a black coffee, and he ordered the exact same thing without looking at the menu. And we both noticed it at the same moment, and neither of us said anything about it. But something shifted in the air between us. Something small and significant and tentative, like the first green thing pushing through frozen ground in early spring. We had been meeting like this for 6 weeks, not dramatically, not with tears or confrontations or the cinematic intensity of that parking lot in June, just coffee,
Just two people sitting across a small table and learning each other in the careful, incremental way that adults have to learn people they missed the organic childhood version of knowing. He told me about his architecture firm in Columbus. I told him about my marketing career in Chicago. He told me about his sons, James and Patrick, my half-brothers, who had both separately reached out to me and with whom I had been exchanging careful, curious, genuinely warm text messages for 3 months. I told him about my apartment, my friends, the life I had built with my own 2 hands in a city where nobody knew my mother's name. We were figuring out what we were to each other. It was slow. It was uncomfortable sometimes. It was also unexpectedly, occasionally wonderful. My mother and I had started therapy together. I want to be honest about how strange that sentence felt the first time I said it out loud. Diane, in a therapist's office, being asked to examine her feelings. The first session, she had sat with her spine perfectly straight and her hands folded in her lap and answered every question with the careful precision of someone testifying in court. By the 4th session, she had cried twice and admitted, out loud to a professional, that she had spent 30 years punishing her daughter for her own shame. Progress is not linear, but it is real. Vanessa and I talked every Sunday now. Real conversations, not the logistical, surface-level exchanges of two people maintaining the appearance of a relationship, but actual conversations where we said actual things and occasionally disagreed and occasionally laughed until we couldn't breathe and were building slowly and deliberately the genuine sisterhood that the complicated architecture of our childhood had never quite allowed. Derek, her husband, had sent me a handwritten note 2 weeks after the wedding that said simply, "For what it's worth, I think you're remarkable. Welcome to the family," the real version of it. I had put it on my refrigerator. I looked at Thomas across the coffee shop table. I said, "James wants to meet in person, all 3 of us. He's suggesting Thanksgiving." Thomas looked at me carefully. "How do you feel about that?" I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. "I'm terrified," I said honestly, "and ready."
The house smelled like rosemary and butter, and something sweet underneath both of those things. And I stood on the front porch of Thomas Caldwell's Columbus home on a cold November Thursday with a bottle of wine in one hand and my own heartbeat loud in my ears. And I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about how strange and non-linear and completely unscripted real life actually is compared to the version of it you imagine when you're lying awake at night rehearsing your future. I had imagined this moment approximately 40 times since James had proposed it. None of my imaginings had adequately prepared me for the reality of standing on an actual porch in front of an actual door behind which actual people who shared my blood were waiting. People I was still learning, people who were still learning me. All of us attempting something that didn't have a template or a roadmap or a guarantee of any kind. I rang the doorbell. James opened the door. He was tall, taller than Thomas, with his father's dark hair and something around the eyes that was startlingly, disarmingly familiar in the way that Thomas's jaw and shoulders had been familiar in that parking lot 5 months ago. He was 27 years old, and he had his father's careful stillness, and he looked at me for exactly 1 second before breaking into a smile so genuine and so unguarded that it walked straight past every defense I had and landed somewhere warm and unprotected inside my chest. "Hi," he said, the same word I had texted him from a dark rental car in June. "Hi," I said back. Patrick appeared behind him, shorter, broader, with a chaotic energy that was apparently entirely his own, because it didn't seem to come from Thomas or from me. He was 24, and he immediately said, "She has Dad's eyes, James, I told you," with the zero-filter confidence of someone who had apparently decided that we were already family, and the awkward part was optional. I laughed, genuinely, freely, fully.
Thomas appeared behind both of them, and something in his face when he saw me standing in his doorway with a bottle of wine and wet eyes and a real laugh just beginning to fade, something in his face did the fracturing thing again, that quiet fracturing along the grain. We ate together for 4 hours. It was messy and imperfect, and conversations sometimes stalled in the particular way of people who are still learning each other's rhythms. Patrick told terrible jokes. James asked thoughtful questions. Thomas cooked exceptionally well, which I filed away as information about myself that I found oddly satisfying. At the end of the night, I hugged all three of them. Driving back to my hotel, I called Vanessa. "How was it?" she asked immediately. I thought about James's smile and Patrick's zero-filter confidence and Thomas's fractured face in the doorway. "It was a beginning," I said. The reception hall looked completely different, empty. I had called ahead, spoken to the venue manager, a soft-spoken woman named Gloria, who hadn't asked many questions when I explained that I needed 20 minutes alone in the space, just 20 minutes, and had driven the 2 hours from Columbus on a gray December morning with nothing but black coffee and a playlist I had made specifically for difficult drives. Gloria unlocked the doors and let me in and disappeared discreetly. And I stood alone in that marble hall in my winter coat and my boots, and I looked at the room where my life had cracked open 6 months ago. It was smaller than I remembered. That's the thing about the locations of our most significant moments. Memory inflates them, gives them cathedral ceilings and infinite dimensions to match the enormity of what happened inside them. But standing there in the December quiet, with the chairs stacked against the walls and the chandeliers dimmed to their lowest setting and the marble floor stripped of its wedding night shimmer, it was just a room. A nice room, certainly, but just a room. I walked to the center of the dance floor. I stood exactly where I had stood when I picked up the microphone. I looked out at the empty space where 200 people had been sitting, where Marco, the DJ, had stood frozen behind his equipment, where my mother had crossed the floor towards me with the deliberate walk of a woman who had never once been told no. I stood there, and I let the memory of that night move through me completely, not fighting any part of it, not curating it into something more comfortable, just letting all of it exist simultaneously. The burning cheek, the dropped microphone, Vanessa's wedding dress rustling across the floor, my mother's hand over her mouth, Thomas's navy suit in the back of the room, the letter, the parking lot, the amber lights. All of it. I had spent 6 months in therapy, my own therapist in Chicago, twice a week, a calm and perceptive woman named Dr. Okafor, who had an uncanny ability to ask the one question that unlocked 12 others. 6 months of sitting across from her and excavating the archaeology of my own history, carefully, layer by layer, understanding not just what had happened, but why it had shaped me the specific ways it had, which parts of my architecture were genuinely mine, and which parts were damage I had mistaken for personality. I had learned a lot in 6 months. I had learned that I was angrier than I knew, and sadder than I admitted, and stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out the microphone I had brought from home, a small, handheld one, nothing fancy, the one I used for voice memos. I held it at my side for a moment. Then I raised it, and quietly, alone in that empty room, I said everything I hadn't finished saying in June.
"My name is Rachel," I said, and my voice moved through that empty marble hall and came back to me softly, the way voices do in spaces built for gathering, even when the gathering is done. I am 31 years old, and I am finally, completely, irrevocably okay. I let that land. Not for an audience, there was no audience, for myself, for the 7-year-old eating birthday dinner alone in the yellow kitchen, for the 9-year-old losing her father on a Tuesday in October, for the 22-year-old loading 2 suitcases into a taxi with her jaw set and her eyes dry, telling herself that leaving was strength, for all of them. I came back here because I needed to finish something, I continued, my voice steady and unhurried in the quiet. Not for closure. I have learned that closure is mostly a myth we tell ourselves because the truth, which is that things don't close but instead transform, is harder to put on a greeting card. Not for revenge, not for an audience. I paused. For me, just for me. Maybe for the first time in my life, just entirely, unapologetically for me. I walked slowly across the dance floor as I spoke, my boots quiet on the marble. Here is what I know now that I didn't know 6 months ago. I know that my father, Richard, my real father, the man who chose me, loved me with a completeness that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with character, and that I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that love by loving other people with the same uncomplicated generosity. I stopped walking. I know that my mother is a flawed, damaged, genuinely remorseful woman who did real harm to her daughter and is doing the hard, unglamorous work of acknowledging that, and that I am choosing, not for her sake but for mine, to stay at the table while she does that work. I took a breath. I know that I have 2 half-brothers, one who tells terrible jokes and one who asks beautiful questions, and that family, it turns out, is not always the thing you were born into, but sometimes the thing you walk toward, one careful, terrifying, worthwhile step at a time. I raised the microphone one final time. And I know this, I said quietly. The girl who stood in this room 6 months ago and picked up a microphone because nobody handed her one, she wasn't broken. She was never broken. She was just waiting for someone to finally tell her the truth. I paused. So she told it herself. I lowered the microphone. I stood in the center of that empty dance floor for one long, final, breathing moment. Then I put the microphone in my pocket, buttoned my coat, and walked toward the door. Gloria was waiting quietly in the lobby. She handed me my keys without a word, which was exactly right. I stepped outside into the December air. It was cold and clean and sharp with the particular clarity of winter mornings that feel like the world has been reset overnight. Everything stripped back to its essential elements, nothing extra, nothing false, just the bare and honest bones of things. I stood on the sidewalk and I threw up my arms, just like a 3-year-old girl on a red tricycle in a yellow raincoat, completing her circle, claiming her joy like it belonged to her. Because it did. It always had. Thank you for watching every single part of Rachel's story. If this journey moved you, challenged you, or made you feel seen, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another story. Because everyone deserves to pick up their own microphone.